Ladies and gentlemen, if you could take your seats, please, we'll start in 1 minute.
Good evening, friends, and welcome or welcome back to JW3. I'm Raymond Simonson. I'm very proud to be the CEO of JW3, and it's just so wonderful to see so many of you here in the room tonight, and hello to everybody watching from home, wherever you are. It was a real great honor when Uri called me to speak about doing this event, because I had the great honor and privilege, like some of you in this room, of actually knowing Yoni Jesner when he was a young madrich in Bnei Akiva, and I used to help train all of the youth leaders from across the country. And he was an inspirational young man, and one of the many things we took from him were these aphorisms, Yoni Jesner sayings that so many of you know, and I think they're still on the Yoni Jesner website, I believe. One of them was, and I hope I get the wording right, "Don't be late, always be prompt," I think was one of his. So you know if I'm looking at you now. But the other one I wanted to leave you with, and then I'm going to move away, is because I love this and it's so poignant and it's so perfect for this evening's event and for our speakers. Because Yoni told us that every human being is beautiful. Each has his own needs, wants, desires and passions, which serve to complement and influence our experiences. This realization not only heightens our empathy towards each other, but sets each person a mission. A beautiful words to set us up for this evening. And I'd like to introduce to you Uri Jesner. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond, to you and your team for helping put on this event this evening. We're really grateful. Good evening. Your Grace and Mrs. Welby, Chief Rabbi, Jonathan Friedland, family, friends, welcome to the Yoni Jesner Conversations. The Yoni Jesner Foundation was set up in memory of my youngest brother, Yoni, an inspirational youth leader and role model who was tragically killed in a suicide bombing on a bus in Tel Aviv on the 19th of December 2002, age 19. Yoni was due to study medicine at UCL, and so, when he was killed, our family donated his organs for transplantation, ensuring that in death, if not in life, Yoni was able to save the lives of others. There were 5 recipients of Yoni's organs, including a 7-year-old Palestinian girl who received one of his kidneys. Yoni connected with all people of all ages and backgrounds. He counted a diverse range of people amongst his friends. He was mature and emotionally intelligent beyond his 19 years and was able to get the best out of others, whatever the circumstances. Yoni's aphorisms, which Raymond just mentioned, found in his backpack on the day he was killed, include the following, which relate to engagement with others. Go to people where they are, not where you want them to be. Approaches to different problems and situations will vary from person to person. Different approaches does not necessarily mean that it's wrong. Always listen when people tell you about themselves and learn from those around you. The legacy Yoni left, through a combination of the circumstances of his death and the organ donation to a young Palestinian, together with the inspirational person he was, led us, his family and friends, to establish the Yoni Jesner Conversations, a fitting tribute to a young man who in his life and through his death brought people together. Little did we realize that 20 years later, conversing, entering into dialogue with others, speaking to people with different views, perspectives, and beliefs, having difficult conversations would seem more challenging to achieve, and yet would be more important than ever. Conversation is the glue that binds us together as human beings. The theme of difficult conversations resonates with the kind of person the Yoni we knew and loved was, sensitive to others, always seeking to engage and building relationships. But it wasn't just Yoni and his story that precipitated this particular conversation. Although they don't know this, it was the discussions between and with our two conversationalists this evening that made clear to me that they were the right people for this job. I've been fortunate to be in the room where it happens, to see at close quarters how religious leaders grapple with difficult issues, and in my view, there are no better examples of this than His Grace, the Most Reverend and Right Honourable Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Chief Rabbi Sir Ephraim Mervis, Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth. I have the privilege of working with the Chief Rabbi on a daily basis, and I see how he contends with the issues that come across his desk. Complex and challenging issues, and so difficult conversations are the order of the day. What is most striking about the issues and the related challenging conversations is the humility, sensitivity, and wisdom with which the Chief Rabbi approaches the subject matter, always open to listening and learning, actively seeking the input and perspective of others. Equally, Archbishop Justin is the epitome of humility and compassion. In all our engagement with him and his team at Lambeth Palace, he and they could not be more sensitive and sincere, genuinely grappling with the issues of the day, including matters pertaining to Jews and Judaism. We come from different faiths, different traditions and perspectives, but the mutual respect, appreciation, and friendship runs deep. And whilst these words roll off the tongue easily, we must not take them for granted. Faith leaders have not and do not always see eye to eye, nor disagree well. This evening's conversation is testament to two great religious leaders of their time who lead with conviction, but also by their example of humility and empathy, sowing the seeds of reconciliation and growth. We can learn so much from them. In the portion of the Torah that we read last week, as we work our way through the annual cycle of the 5 books of Moses, we read from the latter part of Shemot, the book of Exodus, detailing the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the temporary, portable sanctuary that the children of Israel were instructed to make. The Torah tells us, "Va'asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham," and they shall make for me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell amongst them. It's often assumed that we build the sanctuary so that God can dwell in it, but that's not actually what the verse says. We build the sanctuary so that God can dwell amongst us. Many of the classical biblical commentators pick up on this. In fact, the 19th century rabbi known as Malbim, who came from somewhere today in western Ukraine, says that each of us is to build a sanctuary in our heart, to be a place for God to dwell. God doesn't live in a building. God lives where we create space for him, where we let him in. And how do we do that? Well, the answer is the Hebrew word for sanctuary, which is mikdash, from the word kadosh, which means holy. When we, through our actions, create sanctity by doing that which is good, we then enable God to dwell amongst us. And who better to converse about difficult conversations this evening than our two conversationalists, both men of God who seek the holy and who through their own faith traditions and dedicated good work bring God closer. I want to express my personal thanks to the Chief Rabbi and the Archbishop of Canterbury from the family and the foundation for giving of their time this evening. And thank you to Mrs. Caroline Welby for being here with us as well. Finally, thank you to you all for joining us for this very special conversation to commemorate the 20th anniversary of Yoni's death and to celebrate all that has been achieved in his memory. I now want to hand over to Jonathan Friedland, journalist, author, broadcaster, and podcaster extraordinaire. He needs no introduction. Jonathan, one of the most incisive and insightful thinkers around today, who helps many of us make sense of the events shaping our political landscape. We're delighted and honored you were able to make the time to be with us this evening and to facilitate this conversation. Your Grace, Chief Rabbi, you're in very good hands.
Thank you very much indeed, Ari, and all of you for that warm welcome. When I told people about the format for this evening, I would say, well, there's the Archbishop of Canterbury, there's a chief rabbi, and there's a journalist. And there would be this pause, and I could see they were waiting for a punchline, ideally involving walking into a bar. But it's not quite like that. Instead, it's going to be a conversation of the three of us for the first chunk of our time, and then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. And very much, as Ari said there, a conversation between particularly our two honoured speakers. Ari mentioned there this phrase, difficult conversations, and this is being billed, the theme of the evening is difficult conversations. So my slightly sort of contrary thought is this a difficult conversation? Or, in fact, would it be for both of you almost the easier conversation than either of you would have with people who are not, to use Ari's phrase, men of God? In other words, is it much easier for you two to connect than it is for you to cross that divide with people who are of no faith?
Do you want to go first? Or I can go first?
I'm happy to. I'm not sure that's an either-or. So I suppose, just to be difficult, I don't quite accept the premise of the question. So I think often the most difficult conversations I have are with other Anglicans. But I'll leave the chief to...
There was a laugh of recognition from the chief.
Yeah, there was a sort of...
Who was thinking, wait till you see the Jews. But go on, you explain that a little bit more.
And, I mean, for me, we have had to have, I wouldn't say they were difficult conversations, but sensitive conversations between us. And I wanted to go first, simply because I wanted to say two things. First, they are easier because I absolutely trust Ephraim in what he says, that he will, I've never known him to speak, in the 10 years pretty well that we've known each other, I've never known him to speak except out of a genuine heart of integrity. And therefore, when he speaks, even if it's a sensitive issue, I know that I can trust that there's no hidden agenda. And I think the other thing I wanted to say, which is not answering your question, but then in these jobs one has to be a politician to some degree, is to say how privileged I feel to be here, Arian, for your brother's 20th anniversary of his death. And I'm reminded, and I just want to express my real sorrow, that there will be a couple of families in Israel, a bit more now, from recent deaths, who will be mourning as you will have done so deeply 20 years ago. And I just want to say in this audience how sorry I am about that. But
So could I likewise express my sense of privilege in participating in this evening's conversation in memory of a truly legendary person, Yoni Jesner, Zichrono Livracha. And Justin, we're friends, but actually what I would love our entire community to know more than ever before is it's not just a friendship between the two of us.
yeah.
In the Archbishop of Canterbury, we have one of our greatest friends, a friend of Jews and a friend of Judaism. And the fact that he's here this evening, in the midst of enormous issues that he is dealing with, is testament to the extent to which he's committed to strengthening relationships with Jews and with Judaism. And, you know, when you ask Jonathan, well, this is definitely one of the easiest conversations, although it's easier when it's just the two of us and you don't have a whole big crowd of people listening in.
A lot of eavesdroppers this evening.
Absolutely. But I've really been looking forward to this evening's event. And I think the reason is that when you converse with a friend a dear friend, then it's always a treat. It's always something special. In the Bible, when God created Eve, he created her as an ezer kenegdor. It's translated as a helpmeet, but that's not a good translation. Ezer means to help, kenegdor means to be against him. Because ultimately, if you truly love somebody, you will offer constructive advice. Sometimes you'll be with them, sometimes you'll be against them, and it will be palatable because you know the person loves you, and it's coming from the right place.
That's right.
And that's why conversations of this sort amongst dear friends are a real treat.
In a way, both of your answers have sort of validated my question, I think, because I was wondering if it's easier for the two of you to talk to each other than it would be for either of you to talk to someone who doesn't come from a faith tradition. You have a starting point in common that makes that conversation easier, and you, Chief Rabbi, said it is. This is one of the easier conversations. In a way, there's not that gulf to cross.
Yes, so certainly I automatically connect with people of faith, whoever they might be, within Judaism and well beyond Judaism. And we automatically connect because we share something very deep in common. And I admire enormously people who are driven by their faith, who are willing to go the extra mile for the sake of God, and who are leaders of faith. And as a result, I've been privileged to establish many very dear connections across the globe.
I think that's really interesting because more and more, for years and years, when I've travelled across the Anglican Communion, particularly in the Global South, people have said, and Americans, particularly in the southern part of the US, from the more conservative backgrounds, have said, well, of course, Islam is taking over Europe. And, do you remember that bloke who said, from Fox News or something, who said, it's Birmingham is now a no-go area for Christians. Well, I know the Bishop of Birmingham very well. We used to stroll around Birmingham when I was visiting. It was certainly not a no-go area. But it isn't other faiths that are the challenge for mutually comprehensible conversations at the moment, I think. I think it is religious illiteracy. The sense that people don't understand that there can be people whose faith means that there are many things more important than their own advantage or their career or their past or their future, that there's something that holds you very, very deeply. And we both know that sometimes when dealing with government or when dealing with people outside the faith background, you really have the sense that you're talking a slightly different language.
And I very much lament the marginalization of religion today.
Yeah.
To some degree, it's even the banishing of religion from the public square. Sometimes it's simply because of an increase in secularization, but sometimes it's purposeful, coming out of a humanist agenda. And I believe that our society is all the poorer with a lack of religious input and direction. So you and I, Justin, were at COP26, where we met together, and both of us were there for the same purpose, although I must congratulate you. You went up by train. I was in a rush. I got a plane. So, it just felt wrong going to a climate change.
I went both ways on overnight train, successive nights, and it took, you probably were fine by 2 days later. It took me a week before.
No. Okay, but you were doing it as part of your battle against climate change, which is marvelous, so I envy you. But both of us were there in order to give a religious tone to the conversation. And interestingly, in Abu Dhabi just 2 weeks ago, I was speaking to the minister in the Emirates government who's responsible for hosting COP28, which will be in Abu Dhabi in November, December this year. And I implored him, please, to have a stronger faith voice.
Yes.
Because our Bible, our shared Bible, is all about the earth and our responsibility to look after it. And faith leaders need to be heard on this subject. I'll give you another example. Just before COVID, I addressed the European Parliament on artificial intelligence. And I implored them, please, listen to faith voices, because the world is moving so quickly. And I gave an example of one day we'll be in driverless cars, and the car will be moving, and suddenly a person will run in front of the car, and in a split second, the car will need to make a decision to go forward, to move to the right to hit a pedestrian on the sidewalk, or to move to the left and crash into a tree. Now, who is controlling the decision that the cars will be making on our behalf? There aren't any faith leaders. And surely we should be having a say in the future of our society.
I think that, sorry, Jonathan.
Well, why don't you respond just specifically to whether there's an ethics input to artificial intelligence? Because I think the tech companies do talk about having ethicists involved, but they always use that word, ethicists. They don't talk about faith leaders. But just comment on that, and then there's a very specific question I want to put arising out of the Chief Rabbi's last remark.
There's something about ethics within faith that doesn't put the ethics at the end of the journey, but puts God at the end of the journey and an accountability to God, which means that it is worth any sacrifice. In your illustration, I would say the right thing is to drive into the tree because you're not hurting a human being.
You might be killing yourself.
Yes, but that's less important in some way. Probably not for oneself, but not that one would know much about it. But the other side, I remember, Caroline probably remember, we had the most extraordinary conversation with some very senior military who'd come to dinner about 4 years ago, and we were talking exactly about AI, about artificial intelligence, and the ethics of the battlefield. So if you have a self-driving tank or a drone, and they are introducing AI into drones, a drone with weapons on it, how can it recognize someone who's trying to surrender? How does it show mercy to the wounded?
Absolutely.
How does it give the soldiers surrounded and terrified an opportunity to surrender? Human beings very often don't do that, but they very often do.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to kill. Now, and I think nobody knows how to, and the answer from the generals was, it's something that gives us absolute, we are very conscious of this and we have no idea how to deal with it. Because they, as with most senior military now, they've all been in battle, in Afghanistan or Iraq. And they know exactly what that means and the need that sometimes you don't pull the trigger.
Yeah.
I want to pick up your reference to faith in the public square and just put a very specific example to you. When Ari was kind enough to phone me about doing this tonight, the name in the news for that news cycle was Kate Forbes, the woman who is a candidate to be Nicola Sturgeon's successor as First Minister of Scotland and leader of the SNP. And I don't want now to get into the substance of this issue because that's actually in some ways not the interesting point, but she said that she would have voted against equal marriage, but she was happy for that now to be the law of the land because she said she would put her own faith, she's a very committed Christian, she would put her own faith to one side and instead defer to majority opinion. And it just struck me that, as I say, putting the specific issue to one side, there's a very interesting question there. Is that what we should demand of religious believers who want to have a role in public life, that they put aside their religious belief when it clashes with majority opinion, and instead that they become the instrument of the democratic majority? Do you want to pick that up, Archbishop?
Well, not a lot, but I will. I think this comes back to the issue of religious literacy. Because, again, from a faith position, it's not you put your faith aside, but you put, and nor is it a choice between your faith and the majority view. There are plenty of times, I remember a conversation with David Cameron when he had said that British values are democracy, the rule of law, and freedom of expression, I think, or freedom of religious belief, I can't remember which. And a number of the bishops said that they didn't agree. And I happened to have a meeting with him quite soon afterwards, and we were sitting there. And his opening line as we sat down, didn't even say good morning. He said, what's wrong with your bishops? I'll leave that, what he said, asterisk. What's wrong with your bishops that they don't like my British values? And I said, they're not values, they're not British, and we don't practice them, but otherwise it's fine. And we had quite a vigorous conversation.
Vigorous.
Vehement. I'm always told not to be vehement. But the point about that, it's not a choice between religious value and democracy. Democracies, and we can all pick examples, where democracies have voted for something atrocious, evil, deeply, deeply wrong. And there are moments when you say, I don't care what the majority says, but there are other moments when you say, I need to love my neighbour, I need to respect the society in which we live, because good order, certainly within the Christian tradition, is part of the gift of God to a society. I'm sure it's part of the Jewish tradition as well, but I'm not going to say what's part of the Jewish tradition in front of the chief rabbi, because
It's okay.
it'd be like...
I was going to say, if you start telling the chief rabbi about Jewish tradition and what's right and what's wrong in front of this crowd, you'll fit right in.
Yes, and if it was Anglicans, he'd fit right in if he did the same to me.
Yeah.
But so that's it seems to me at the heart of it is it's a much more complex question of love for neighbour, the ordering of society, and knowing where the boundaries are.
Yeah, I remember Tim Farron, similar kind of
Yes,
situation.
absolutely.
The way in which Tony Blair didn't do God. You know, his momentous speech in Parliament, sending British troops off to fight in Iraq. In his prepared script, it was going to conclude with the words, "May God bless you," and it was taken out by his advisors. For me, it's always refreshing to hear American politicians, God bless you, and God bless America, in God we trust, and so on. And for me, the recent developments in Scotland, I found to be most lamentable, because immediately after Emma Forbes said what she said,
Kate Forbes, yeah.
Kate Forbes, there were a number of people who had been her supporters who immediately pulled out from being part of her attempt to become the next First Minister. It's really up to her and people like her to determine how they're going to balance their views within the democratic system. As the Archbishop says on some occasions, I'm sure they will say, you know what? So I'll put my views to the side, I'll go with the majority, and it won't be a problem for me to preside over a party in a country which is doing this. There might be other occasions where they might say, under no circumstances can I preside, and therefore they will draw the necessary conclusions for their own position. But it is highly lamentable for people not to respect the views of a person of faith, and for somebody who has religion, in the eyes of some, if not many, to immediately be disqualifying themselves from leadership in this country.
Because there you've located the onus on the individual as a matter of conscience. Is this the issue I'm going to press, or or should I just go with the crowd, as it were? But I'm asking in a way whether there's a burden, the onus should be on society to say, even though we don't like this individual's views, we are going to accept them or respect them, whichever we use, because they are they're sprung from religion. And so it should, Scottish politicians have said, look, I don't like Kate Forbes' position on equal marriage, but that's her religious conviction. Therefore, we are under some moral obligation to accept that and let her, vote for her as First Minister because of her other positions, if that's what they think.
But that comes back to something in ultramodern or postmodern philosophy, which, as one of my tutors at college said, there are no absolutes except the view that there are no absolutes, and that's an absolute. And yes, there is, society has to be able to cope with people who say there are absolutes. There are absolutes in, not that one, the trouble is that our past, particularly in Church of England, post 1689, and in the Christian church right back into the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, has seen it necessary to enforce on society, and particularly on Jewish communities, that they either convert or are eliminated or leave, in the Spanish case. And that history discredits us. But we need to remember, when we're asking this question, that we have, in the last 8 months, lost a head of state whose own Christian convictions were absolute and beyond a single shadow of doubt, and who, in her utterances, and particularly at Christmas, but very often at other times, was quite clear about her Christian conviction and about its inclusivity, and we trusted her. And she said to the Church of England in 2012, the Queen at a speech at Lambeth Palace, said, "The duty of the Church of England is to protect and be an umbrella for other faiths, as well as the Christian faith, to be fervently Christian, but also an umbrella for others." And His Majesty the King, in a meeting, which I presume you were at, just a couple of days after.
Correct, in the palace.
In the palace, said exactly the same.
Yes.
And it never occurred, nobody said, quite rightly, we all trust him. Nobody said, oh, well, can we trust the king because he's very clearly Christian? Might he do the wrong thing? So there is something there about consistency of life and trust, which society today forgets about, that need for trust as a way of making tolerance and respect for the other work. You can't respect someone who you think might be about to betray you.
But this goes to my point at the beginning, really, about difficult conversations. We think that we're very tolerant of difficult conversations, but we only really tolerate them when they're easy. And so I wonder if convictions rooted in faith and religious teachings are now only really admissible in public when they happen to match majority opinion. So in other words, both of you do Thought for the Day on the radio. When the speaker says about the sanctity of nature, and that's why climate change is terrible, everyone nods, and that's fine. But if you were to go to some of the other absolutes in both of your faiths, the audience might not like that so much, and therefore, and I don't know how many of either you or your colleagues ever really go there, but instead stick to the slightly safer shores where there's a democratic consensus.
So I try to strike a balance. Obviously.
Well, you're much better than me at doing it. I always listen to it. I will confess, I always listen to you with a sense of envy and think, I wish I could do it like that.
No, but you gave a great message just a few days ago.
Yeah, every now and then you're bound to hit the ball. If you swing the bat enough.
So certainly a public speaker wants to be liked. And in order to strike a chord, in order to make an impact, your words need to resonate with your audience. At the same time, within a popular tone and a likable framework, one must, I believe we've got a responsibility to get out there and put over important messages. Otherwise, why are we in our positions? Just to say the things that please people. And it's the same thing for rabbis and priests from their pulpits. Yes, we can tell jokes, we can be funny, we can be entertaining, but ultimately we are there to sway minds, to inspire people to lead better lives. And I think we have to go out there. And we can't wave the white flag in the midst of a humanist environment. On the contrary,
Absolutely.
deep down, people are very spiritual. And if we know how to strike that chord, they will respond well. For me, one of the greatest revelations of the pandemic was a series of academic studies undertaken in a number of universities, primarily Harvard, which determined that people believed more during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Approximately, there was a 25% increase of spirituality globally. And I'll never forget seeing on my PC a photograph from the Daily Mirror from August 2020 of a 20-year-old young lady with her hands clasped like this in front of her computer screen while she was praying. People's, what we call their neshamas, their souls are very active. They're yearning for expression. I think one of our greatest challenges is the fact they're not necessarily coming to established religion to find that expression. Therefore, we need to go and meet them, and we need to challenge them to express it in the best way.
It is, I mean, there are two examples, both from Thought for the Day. Many years ago, I was doing Thought for the Day. I was asked to do it on Good Friday, when we remember the crucifixion. And naively, I assumed that I should talk a bit about the crucifixion. And I got a call from the BBC where they said, there's a bit too much Jesus in this. And
I've never been told that.
well, there you see it. I mean, this is just bias, isn't it? No, and I said, I'm the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it's Good Friday. What do you expect me to talk about? You know, football? Yeah. Anyway, so that was one example, and that I would put down to a level of religious illiteracy. The other one was, you mentioned the Thought for the Day on the anniversary of the Ukraine war last Friday. There was only one paragraph, and it was the last paragraph, where I got serious criticism for. And in that paragraph, it was the headline on the Daily Telegraph, very deliberately, and a weekly, The Spectator, had a whole article about how terrible it had been that I'd spoken in the way I had. And in that paragraph, I talked about the need after a just, and it was very clearly, after a just peace without enforcement from outside, that Ukraine could reach of its own will. After that, we had to look at a security structure that could avoid future wars, and a security structure that gave all sides a sense of being able to live together and not feel a constant sense of fear, leading to another horrendous war. And of course, I was there in December in north of Kyiv, and it was the most extraordinary experience to be in a country that is in a full-scale war of Second World War industrialized character, and that's been going on for a year. And that was the paragraph, this is your point, that was the paragraph that got the criticism. Because it's all very good that you say that the Archbishop says we must support Ukraine, that we must make sure that justice and impunity, that there's no impunity and that there's justice and etc. But how dare you begin to suggest that at some point there is going to need to be reconciliation? Yeah. At that point, you've stepped over the boundary.
Into politics.
Well, into stupid, depends who you listen to. Into politics, into stupidity, into being the typical Archbishop of Canterbury. And I think you've put your finger on it. We can't run up the white flag And I don't know how you feel. There are moments when I know something's got to be said in the public square. Last Easter sermon, just after the Rwanda policy had been announced, and we put in two paragraphs, and Richard will remember the conversation. On the Friday, it had been announced Thursday evening in the middle of the greatest Christian holy festival of the year. It was announced by the government that about the Rwanda policy. We had an emergency phone call with the senior staff. Do you remember on the Friday, Richard? And everyone agreed something's got to be said, and I wrote a paragraph and slipped in. I remember my sense of longing to skip that paragraph.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The responsibility weighs very heavily on one's shoulders. Should you go for it? Should you not? How's it going to be received? We can never accurately predict what the response might be from our own people, from other people. Sometimes one can unwittingly stray into the political field. I'll give you an example. So I had a thought for the day for Radio Scotland rejected. What do you think of that?
Oh, they've never done that to me. They just said there was too much God.
No, so it was in May of the year leading up to the referendum. And I was in Edinburgh, and I came into, the idea was for me to come into the BBC studio and for it to be broadcast live. And I sent the script,
yeah, as you do.
And it was just before our festival of Shavuot, which is Pentecost. And what I had written was that the Israelites were leaving the yoke of their Egyptian bondage in search of an independent future as their own people. So it was just a nice Jewish idea. But it was absolutely rejected.
Yeah, well, I sort of get that one.
Yeah. I think so too.
Did you change it? Or
yes, I changed it.
You got
Yeah.
the right.
Tell us one which was deliberate, where you deliberately knew it, where you'd heavily on your shoulders, you thought this is going to be difficult, but I have to do it, I have to say
Oh,
it
I
anyway.
can think of one.
So, well, there are thoughts for the day.
No, just more generally.
More
This time
generally.
when you've taken a stance.
Yeah, I would say Church of Scotland. I don't know what you were thinking of.
Go on, tell us what you mean about Church of Scotland.
Okay, so I came into office September 2013, and one of the first issues I needed to deal with was a publication issued by the Church of Scotland called The Inheritance of Abraham, which was clearly anti-Semitic. And it subscribed to the supersessionist theory whereby God has rejected the Jewish people from being his chosen people. The Christians have taken the place of the Jews. The Holocaust is the outright confirmation of God's rejection of his people, etc., etc.
Really?
So, and that was Church of Scotland, policy, a document, a statement. And our Jewish community in Scotland they just didn't know what to do with this and turned to me. And my response was to actually go to Edinburgh and to address the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, which was in April 2014. Yeah. And I came in there, and I felt as if I was in a lion's den.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was given 15 minutes. The first 5 minutes were jokes. If you want later on, I can share them with you. But anyway, the whole idea was, let's get on well, right? Jokes about rabbis, priests, etc. And then easing my way into the argument, and then telling them from the heart what I thought and how out of order they had been. And the response, thank God, was great.
What happened?
So first of all, in the corridors immediately afterwards, so many people coming up to me, well, it was this particular committee which had written it, don't hold us all responsible, we are absolutely with you. But what was more significant was what we did immediately afterwards. Together with the principal clerk of the Church of Scotland, we established regular study groups, priests and rabbis. And they have been continuing for the last 9 years. We've developed a glossary of terminology through which we can start to understand each other through dialogue. Talking about difficult conversations, gosh, these have been exceptionally difficult, but I'm pleased to report that I will be back at the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in May of this year to address them in order to celebrate the completion of our glossary, and we're in a much better place. So I think had I not had that courage to confront them all out in friendship and with warmth, but to tell them from the heart how wrong they had been, we would never have been able to move forward.
I'm very glad you've got us to the specific relationship between Jews and Christians with this topic. And I want us to live up to our billing of difficult conversations and go to some of the more difficult things. I said at the beginning that maybe this is sort of easy for you two, because there's obviously very clearly, everyone in the room now can see it, there's an ease between the two of you. When you hear a phrase like Judeo-Christian values, which somehow implies that there's common ground, almost theologically, between the two, I wonder if that is a phrase that is meaningful to you, or whether it only goes so far, because let's face it, and you've touched on it, theologically there is one very big gap between you, and obviously that would be, you know, the big theological question that separates Jews and Christians. I'm talking, of course, about Jesus. Do you two, in your own conversations, ever go there? Or do you just immediately, is there a tacit understanding, we don't talk about the things that separate Jews from Christians, we're only going to talk about the common ground?
Where often there is so much that needs to be talked about, that is more or less common ground. I think we've had some conversations. God's
unfailing word.
God's unfailing
That's
word.
what you were referring to earlier, I think.
Yes.
Yes.
This is the document in which you actually contributed.
That's a very significant example of difficult
And that
conversations.
is, it's about, one little bit of that concerned the issue of evangelism directed towards the Jewish people. And quite rightly, it was decided that, you know, in the words of one of the managers of Liverpool Football Club, we needed to let the chief rabbi get his retaliation in first. And it wasn't quite like that. But you wrote the
afterword.
The afterword, that's right. Brilliantly, graciously, and extremely clearly and firmly.
And I felt bad about...
I didn't... you rang up and said, I'm so sorry about... You know, I said...
Explain to people who are new to this, what is it you said in the afterward that made you feel better?
So if I could give an example,
yes.
You know, I was saying, in your document, you are saying that evangelism amongst the Jews is acceptable, right? As opposed to the Catholic position, where they had denounced any form of evangelism. And my point was that there are so many Jewish people who are a bit suspicious about Jewish-Christian dialogue, and I needed to spell it out. What's in it for them? Oh, they just want to convert all of us. And I hear that often to this day, and it angers me, because I know that that is not the case in nearly every instance. But if in a document you are officially stating that this can be an integral part of what the church is about in their view to the Jews, well, then the example I gave was of the beautiful building that you are building, where the foundation is so weak the whole thing's going to fall down. We're engaged in constructive dialogue, in friendship, in warmth, and yet, right at the very source of it all, you are destroying any opportunity for moving properly and constructively forward. So I needed to express that. Thank you for recognizing the graceful way in which I was doing it. And I felt really bad about writing that. But you asked me to, and it's your greatness, Archbishop, in inviting that and in proving that you can disagree with grace and with dignity very sharply, but very constructively.
But do you disagree? I mean, do you
Yes.
disagree with anything that the Chief Rabbi has just said?
Whether I do... Sorry, I'm going to evade the question.
Yeah, and I'm taking that evasion as a yes. You do disagree.
No, it's not a yes. It's just I'm going to get into even more trouble with people. You know as well as I do that Anglicanism is a coalition, and parts of the Church of England and the Anglican Communion would say, absolutely, we disagree. I don't actually disagree with, I'm going to answer it. I don't actually disagree with what Ephraim just said, because I certainly have never for a second held the supersessionist idea. It's complete nonsense, absolute nonsense, in Christian terms, in Christian theological terms, in Christian biblical terms. And the epistle to the Romans goes, it's in black and white. It goes out of its way to say what nonsense that idea is and how wrong that is. And it has remained, I've in an article, I can't remember which, it was one of the Jewish newspapers, I commented that anti-Semitism is the taproot of all racism in European society and in British society, which is probably European, if I'm allowed to say that nowadays. And because what I was thinking of, a point where you very consciously started into the minefield of political controversy, was in late 2019.
Absolutely.
During the election campaign.
Yes.
Well, you both did, actually.
Well, it was his fault, guys.
He started it.
He started it.
Yeah.
No, he did start it, but you rang me up and you said the situation and what is being said by the Labour Party at the moment is completely unacceptable, and I have got to say something. Because the Jewish communities, we know, many of you will witness to the fact that within the Jewish community there was absolute horror at what was happening, particularly with the fear that that would be the government. I think we'd agree that the Labour Party has changed beyond all recognition. Praise God for that. And is a very, 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 so it's not a political point for today. But I said immediately, I will support you. And I said it immediately. It's rather like diving into a very cold swimming pool. The more you think about it, the less attractive the idea seems. And so I thought my view when there are things I'm nervous about is say them at once and then work out how you're going to do it. Because if you don't say it and you think about it, you'll start drawing back. So I said immediately, I'll support you. And I wandered round, I think, to Richard and said, I've just committed us to do X to support you in your writing. And actually you were very kind about the staff we've got, and without hesitation, everybody around me said, good. And nobody suggested for a moment that, are you sure that was a good idea, Archbishop?
But once you had done it and you had essentially sided with the leader of Britain's Jews against a political party, did you get pushback within, I don't mean from leadership circles, Christians saying to you, you've got no business saying this?
Yes, a lot.
An enormous amount, and I can tell you on social media every single day to this day, I expect it, right? I take it as a compliment that so many people say that it was thanks to what I did that we didn't have a different government in December 2019. I don't believe it was because of what I did. I was part of many people who had a role to play. But the Archbishop of Canterbury volunteered to issue his voice on the subject. Every day he comes in for criticism. There was an enormous amount of courage, and we appreciate it enormously.
You're much too kind. I do disagree that it was. I think it would have been cowardice not to say something. I don't think it was courage to say something. It was so obviously right. I knew I would never forgive myself if we didn't speak clearly. And not just because we're friends, but I know my history. And I'm a historian, much better than a theologian, and I'm not that good a historian. And you have to cut these things off straight away, because if you don't, they become overwhelming.
And that was the warning you were giving at the time, actually. We're going to go to questions, but just before we do, the other thought that the phrase Judeo-Christian prompts to me always is an assumption that broad common ground is fine between you two, but if there was a Muslim counterpart here, that would be harder, as if there's much more common ground between these two faiths than that third Abrahamic faith. What do you both think of that? And then we'll take questions from our audience.
Actually, I don't agree with that.
No, nor do I.
In many respects, Judaism and Islam are exceptionally close. Of course, Judaism and Christianity are very close. And it's actually very interesting that the world's very first interfaith organization was established here in London in 1942, the Council of Christians and Jews, established by Chief Rabbi Hertz and Archbishop of Canterbury Temple. It was the forerunner of many other global organizations. Today, Jewish-Muslim dialogue is a top priority alongside Jewish-Christian dialogue. The Muslim world has sadly become so radicalized that it has become an enormous challenge to engage constructively. But thankfully, we are seeing some significant advances in this area, as I'm sure you are experiencing, Justin.
Absolutely.
And, you know, the two of us, a number of years ago, hosted an event at Lambeth Palace, which was under a cloud of secrecy, because the Muslim global leaders who attended all said nobody should ever know we were there, because out of fear, they didn't want it to be known that they were engaging in a constructive dialogue with Christian and Jewish leaders. The result is that it actually was largely a futile day, because it led to nothing. Today, things are changing. The Abraham Accords have certainly helped in that regard. My own personal engagement, together with the engagement of many other Jewish faith leaders in the UAE and in other places, is seeing wonderful results. And just 2 weeks ago, I was there for the opening of the Abrahamic Family House, a most wonderful monument to reconciliation and peace and harmony. And I know you, Justin, are also engaging in that area, and the Pope sent his blessings for the occasion. And we need to take full advantage of the opportunities that now exist to further dialogue and understanding, and I'm actually very optimistic in this regard.
I agree wholeheartedly with that, and I think that the collapse of Daesh, defeated at huge cost of life by other Muslims who sacrificed their lives to defeat them, the pushing back in areas like the Swat Valley of the Pakistani Taliban, which at the cost of tens of thousands of Pakistani soldiers, Muslim soldiers, I think those have given more confidence to many Muslim leaders in a way that they know that what they're doing and what they've been saying for many years is right, that those extremists are not a good representation of authentic Islam. And I think we have seen huge advances. The danger of the shorthand is that that you can pretend that there are no gaps. I mean, Judeo-Christian values, as they're called, Rowan Williams, my predecessor, wonderful predecessor, absolutely refused to use that phrase because he said it hides all kinds of difficulties. And I think Abrahamic faiths can do the same. There are some areas, you say, where Jews and Muslims are very, very close. I mean, you think of issues around payment of interest. There are there are other areas where Christians and Jews are much closer, and so on and so on and so on. But we don't agree on everything, but there are a broad range of things, both theologically and ethically, where we find ourselves on the same side. The difficulty is when governments, whether Christian or Muslim or Jewish, act in a way that brings shame or concern about some of us, about one particular faith, and everybody gets painted with the same brush, as though I don't know, I can think of issues like, President Trump represented all Christianity, or there are numerous examples in our
You mentioned
history.
Jewish governments. There's only one Jewish government. So were you nodding there to Israel and the way that Jews around the world can be associated with decisions taken by that government?
Yes, there can be decisions taken by that government, which I have heard the Board of Deputies and the Chief Rabbi saying, we don't agree, we're very concerned about this. We don't like what's happening in such and such an area. And I think, they did it quite recently, both you and, I can't remember, I was in the middle of yet another episode of discussion about sexuality, I suspect, and they all blend into one. But but I do think, I do remember you doing it. I think I dropped you a line to say thank you very much.
You dropped me a line over the vandalism
That's
in
it.
the cemetery on Mount Zion.
Yeah.
That's right.
And you and both the
Where I was outspoken in my
you were
criticism.
outspoken, so was the Board of Deputies.
Yes.
And we were hugely, and Hussam, Archbishop Hussam in Jerusalem, the Anglican Archbishop in Jerusalem, rang me up and said, that is so helpful in our engagement with the police of the State of Israel, who feel they've got to pay quite a lot of attention, because people like you and the board had spoken out, and really helpful. And
this desecration of Christian groups.
yeah, it was desecration of Christian. Yeah, great.
Let's just try, we've already overshot. I just want to bring in two questions that were submitted in advance. I think we should hear both of them at once. We'll bring them back to our two honoured speakers for their responses, and then we will very sadly have to conclude. The conversation has just raced by. So a question was submitted in advance by Charlotte Gillis. Should we hear that? Murmur of recognition.
Oh.
Obviously got a following.
And given the apparent trend away from established religious faith in this country, can you envisage a time when belief in God might ever be cool or trendy again?
Okay, so hold that in your mind. And then, appropriately for tonight, question number 4 is from Jonathan Jesner.
Oh, thank you.
Yoni was my uncle, and he's a role model to me. Are there any role models, perhaps particular to your faith or perhaps not, who you would say exemplify the qualities needed to navigate challenging conversations?
Thank you. So 2 questions. Will religious faith ever be cool again? And is there a role model, perhaps from outside your own traditions, that you would recommend, particularly perhaps for others who want to navigate difficult conversations? Somebody who is an exemplar in doing that?
Well, I'll give 2 quick answers. I mean, honestly, you're sitting looking at the chief rabbi,
Come on.
and you say, can you be cool and be religious? It's self-evident. No, I think it certainly will, and is in many places, where people see religious people around them and leaders living out what they say. When I find if I'm in a secondary school, the first questions will be asked genuinely about human sexuality in the 6th form. And they will say, what about why are you so against? And when I say I haven't got a good answer, but here's why I haven't got a good answer, and here's what I'm struggling with, I get really warm responses. If I try and blag it, I get really hostile responses. So integrity and honesty, and not being hypocritical, recognizing our own failures, both in the past and in the present, is what seems to be, I'm not sure it's cool, but it certainly attracts attention. Secondly, I have a lot of role models, but if I wanted to think of one that people would know about here, it's the Israeli ambassador who was ambassador when I first became Archbishop. So that's 3 ago.
Daniel Taub.
Daniel Taub, yes. Daniel Taub, because he did his duty superbly. He would engage very seriously with questions and criticism without being defended, and the hospitality of him and his wife and his family was absolutely outstanding. And I just thought, that is someone who Israel has made a very good choice to send as an ambassador.
Very interesting. Thank you. So, Chief Rabbi, will religious faith ever be cool again? And can you name a role model who you think handles this business of difficult conversations inspiringly well?
The great news is religious faith is cool, right?
Yeah.
So it's not a question of will it happen again, it is. The challenge we have today is that the allegiance that people have to religion does not come out of a sense of duty or loyalty. It needs to be a genuine feeling.
Yes. Yeah.
People will go for religion if they believe in it, if they believe that there's something in it for them. We're seeing the same trend with regard to attendances in houses of worship. People don't come anymore, by and large, out of their sense of duty to support community. They come if there's something in it for them. And the great news is there's lots in it for everybody. And I mentioned earlier the yearning of people's souls for expression. And certainly within the Jewish faith, we are finding again and again that our Torah, with its eternal values, speaks through all generations. And perhaps the finest example of this is the Shabbat, the concept of a digital detox day, and the appreciation that our society has for the divine wisdom which guides us today. And it's written for our times in a most inspirational manner.
Here.
we need a name then. We need a name for a role model. We had Daniel Taub from the Archbishop. Who's your nomination?
There are many, many people, and those I would instinctively go for were members of my own family, but I'll go well beyond. As a South African, and I'm going to say the obvious, Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
I mean, needs to be studied, needs to be understood. What an extraordinary human being he was. Bearing in mind his background, what he stood for, what he endured, and his sense of grace, and he had that goal in mind. And that long walk to freedom was achieved. What is being done with his legacy is a different story and is more challenging today. But certainly, as a person who did not hold any sense of bitterness in his heart, but genuinely believed that he was there for the sake of the betterment of his country and all of humankind, I think a great role model.
I'm afraid we are out of time. I'm sorry we couldn't get to the questions of others who submitted them. I just want to say for myself, it's been a great privilege, partly to be here to mark and celebrate the life of Yoni Jesner and to do this event in his memory, but above all to be allowed to eavesdrop on a conversation between two extraordinary faith leaders. And so I'm sure you're going to want to join me in thanking Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Jesner. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you.
Thank you very much. Okay.